So if you followed along closely, you know that it's almost inevitable by the summer of 1776 that the Americans are going to declare their independence, and basically we're going to see the emergence of the American Revolutionary War. Now, as we were concluding the last time I was discussing this matter with you, I underscored how massive of a mismatch this was. This is an enormously huge mismatch in the sense that Britain not only was the most powerful military in the world at the time, the richest country in the world at the time, it had just gotten done defeating the second most powerful country, France, in the French Indian War. So this was a huge upset when it comes to militaries pitted against one another. Okay. Now, there's a very famous image that I bet most of you have seen before, and if you haven't, you can download a copy of this PowerPoint lecture and follow along with me. But the image is of George Washington crossing the Delaware River, okay? And when you see it, it looks very patriotic. It makes you feel very proud. It's seen as very heroic. But in actuality, one of the best-kept secrets in American history is this is an example of George Washington cheating, okay? What do I mean? Well, when we invited a war, what we essentially got at 1776 was a war, and it was a war that we were ill prepared for. I mean, not only were we clearly the weaker country, we didn't do our homework when it comes to how we're going to fight the most powerful country in the world at the time. And so my point in all of this is Washington, the commander of the Continental Army, got his butt kicked out of New York, right? And he had to retreat into the western wilderness. And so the image that you're looking at there is Washington recrossing the Delaware River to hit the British, or at least their allies, in a sneak attack. Now, one of the reasons I need you to understand is he's cheating is there is an unwritten rule in war during that period that when winter came, you would set down your weapons, which was seen as the gentlemanly thing to do, and if the war were to resume, it would resume in the spring when fighting could essentially commence. Washington is crossing the Delaware River on Christmas night, okay? So he's crossing back over at a time when the British are pretty much of the persuasion the war is at a standstill. And their thought was they had defeated the American army, and when the spring sprung the following year, the rebellion would evaporate and the Americans would be willing to come back to the bargaining table, come back into the empire. They underestimated the resolve of Washington and his ingenuity when it comes to being a general. What you're looking at is the moments before what would later become known as the Battle of Trenton. He's crossing the Delaware River, re-entering New Jersey, and the people that he's going to defeat are not actually British soldiers at all. They're actually German mercenaries, people that had been hired by the British government to fight on their behalf. But nonetheless, it is an American victory. I need you to understand something. We need to put it into perspective. Yes, it was an American military. Were the British anywhere closer to surrendering? Absolutely not. Right? This doesn't really even make it on the map when it comes to the military significance as far as Great Britain is concerned. It can more than maintain the fight when it comes to a continuation. Now, it is important nonetheless because it's a moral victory. Okay? As I've alluded to, the war begins exceptionally badly for the Americans, and so what Washington needs is something, anything to keep this, alive in the minds of his troops and his supporters. And the Battle of Trenton is exactly that. It keeps the, possibility of a victory, at least on paper, alive. And there's a lot of people that either enlist or they re-enlist as a result of the battle. Okay? Now, the battle also drives to one of my broader points, and that is we don't need to win this war. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is, basically, if we can either avoid having our army completely annihilated, or having George Washington, the commander of our armies, having him captured, we can we can live to fight another day, okay? Now, that might not sound like it, but it's a very important part of the war. We don't need to win it, we just need to avoid losing it, if you follow me, okay? So the longer we drag this thing out, the more battles of Trenton that we have, we don't crush the British, but we force them to fight another day, the better our chances are of at least negotiating some sort of peace settlement that involves our independence, maybe even winning this thing in a clear-cut victory, okay? So the kind of strategy that Washington will devise is more or less a defensive war. Okay? Now, still, even despite our moral victory at Trenton, we are nowhere near victory by the spring of 1777. Now, in addition to fighting this war on our own, one of the things that's going to be paramount when it comes to emerging victorious is we're going to need some help from another important military in Europe. And if you think about it, there's one particular military that's chomping at the bit to pay the favor back to Britain at the end of 1763, and that would be the French. They would love nothing more than to intervene on our behalf, fight and defeat the British, and make them the laughingstock of the world, the same way that they had made the French the laughingstock in 1763. Here's the problem. We're a long shot. We're a horrible, horrible bet as far as the French are concerned, at least in 1777. That's going to change maybe a little bit as we approach the fall. In the summer of 1777, the Americans won a very important military battle in upstate New York, a battle called Saratoga. Okay? Now, what happened was the British had been on the offensive, and they had been trying to pursue what comes to be known as a three-pronged strategy of attack. And so they've got their armies coming around. What they're trying to do is surround George Washington and force him to surrender. The problem is one of those commanders is just incredibly, incredibly slow. Now, he's very thorough. He's an I dotter and a T crosser, but he takes forever and a day to get anything accomplished. And so one of the men that was waiting for him to meet him at Saratoga was a commander in the British Army named John Burgoyne. And so Burgoyne is waiting and waiting and waiting for these reinforcements to arrive, and ultimately they never arrived. And so the British were fighting at a disadvantage at Saratoga, and that allowed for yet another American victory. Once again, the victory at Saratoga is basically meaningless when it comes to the British ability to continue on to the fight. They're more than capable of continuing on. The significance of the Battle of Saratoga is that it keeps a possibility of an alliance with the French alive. Up until this point, it was iffy, to say the least, as to whether or not the French would come into our assistance and intervene. The Battle of Saratoga and our victory in it goes a long way when it comes to convincing the French that we actually have a shot at winning this thing. The other thing that was quite convincing was Valley Forge. Now, the first thing that I need you to know is Valley Forge was not, I repeat, not a military victory. What it was the campsite in which the Continental Army made their home in the winter of 1777 into 1778. And the other thing that I need you to know about Valley Forge was that the conditions there were absolutely abysmal. Supplies were in short, to say the least. There wasn't enough food. There was virtually no shelter. The troops desperately needed clothing, blankets, and the like, and they were not getting it. And it seemed as if this was, the worst of the worst. Now, the silver lining of Valley Forge was that because it was winter and because you couldn't fight, what the American military commanders could do is focus on developing a professional army. With the help of a German ally, a guy by the name of Baron von Steuben, what they do at Valley Forge is drill the American soldiers on the proper techniques of combat. In other words, they teach them how to fire in unison. They teach them how to march. They teach them how to retreat. And all of this is important because up until Valley Forge, one of the biggest advantages that the British enjoyed was we didn't have a professional army. And so when we would start taking heavy fire, we didn't retreat. We threw down our guns. We headed for the hills. Now, that's important because what comes out of Valley Forge is a tough-nosed, a hardened, veteran military that has now been trained by a professional military commander, von Steuben, and is now perfectly capable of going toe-to-toe with the best that the British can throw at them. So little by little, what the British are doing is they're losing the advantages that they had at the beginning of the war, and they're starting to assume more and more disadvantages. The French are coming in, or at least it looks like it, and certainly the Americans are getting better. Now, at the end of all of this, one of the things that we see is a formal alliance between the French and the Americans. It's called the Treaty of Alliance in 1778. Now, what the Treaty of Alliance says is that the French will come to our assistance, that they officially have declared war on the British. Now, here's why this treaty is important. It transforms what was a civil war, a war between Britain and her colonies, into a world war. I need you to understand that it's not as if the French start showing up in 1778 and they're marching shoulder to shoulder with the Americans. That doesn't happen until well later into the war. The significance is the French start hitting the British elsewhere throughout the British Empire. For instance, they start picking off British sugar islands in the Caribbean. And what that does is it forces the British to kind of spread their already pretty thin army thinner still. And so what you see happen is a world war emerge, and as you might imagine, it's more difficult to be 2 and 3 places at once than to sit there and focus your efforts exclusively on defeating the Americans. Okay? So anyway, what I'd like to do with the time that we have remaining is talk about the later stages of the war. In the later stages, what you begin to see is the British focus their attention further to the south. So when the war began, much of it is being done in the north. Now, toward the end of it, we're seeing that being done more and more in the south. Now, I don't do a lot of military history. If you want this, certainly there are videos, some of which I've embedded into the course content. You can watch them and have more of that if you want. But the long and short of it is the main commander for the British Army, a guy by the name of Charles Cornwallis, manages to get himself surrounded at the Battle of Yorktown. He's surrounded by Washington's troops. He's hemmed in by the French Navy. So it's adding insult into injury. Not only can he not escape, he's essentially in checkmate, right? But he can't get any of his reinforcements in from Great Britain because the French army has blockaded the Atlantic coastal line. So anyway, this Battle of Yorktown seals the fate of the British when it comes to the American Revolutionary War. And ultimately, America is victorious. Now, as early as 1782, American diplomats, including Benjamin Franklin, had been deeply immersed in peace negotiations. Okay? And so what we got was the Treaty of Paris. Now, I want you to understand something about the Treaty of Paris. It really only afforded one winner when it comes to the end of the Revolutionary War. And of course, that winner was us. Not only did we win our independence, because Britain was so eager to end this war, they threw in an incentive for us to go ahead and end the war quickly. They went ahead and said, you know, all that land that was west of the Appalachian Mountains that you all signed up for service in 1754 at the Albany Congress? Remember Ohio and all that land that we thought we were going to go out west and get rich off of? And then in 1763, the British said, oh, by the way, stay off of that because it's permanent Indian country. They were willing to throw in that huge chunk of land. So one of the things that we got out of the Revolutionary War was another half of a continent. We got the future states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, a good chunk of Minnesota. We got future states like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee. And so we were expanding our geographical territory as a result of the Treaty of Paris. Okay? Now, you should understand that not everybody's on the same page when it comes to this. If you think back to Pontiac's Rebellion in 1763, you'll note that whereas the Native Americans said, you might have made peace with the French, they were speaking to the British, but we consider this to be our ancestral homelands, and we will fight you if it comes down to that. So what I'd like you to understand is, even though the British were essentially giving that to us as an incentive for us to end the war quickly, Native Americans had a much different understanding as to what that meant. And you will see coordinated efforts on the part of Native Americans to really hold on to their ancestral homelands. And part of this includes bringing in European powers, especially the British, to achieve that end. Okay? And so when we get to the War of 1812, one of the things that you're going to find out is the Native Americans are lobbying really, really hard for the British to come over here and take the Americans up on this offer for war. I know much of this doesn't make sense right now because you don't have a great context here, but if you want to think about it this way, the American Revolutionary War and the Treaty of Paris is really the beginning of the end when it comes to Native Americans holding on to their ancestral homelands. Now, when we come back, we're going to talk about the newly established government and some of the big challenges when it comes to getting our democratic republic off the ground.